Section 20 of Invisible Links. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. Invisible Links by Selma LagerlÃ. Translated by Pauline Bancroft Flack. A Fallen King, Part 3. It was a Sunday afternoon in the height of the summer. The town looked like a desert of stones, like a moon landscape. There was not a cat to be seen, nor a sparrow, hardly a fly on the sunny wall. Not a chimney smoked. There was not a breath of air in the sultry streets. The whole was only a stony field, out of which grew stone walls. Where were the dogs and the people? Where were the young ladies in narrow skirts and wide sleeves, long gloves and red sunshades? Where were the soldiers and the fine people, the Salvation Army and the street boys? Whither had all those gay picnickers gone in the dewy cool of the morning? All the baskets and accordions and bottles which the steamer landed? And what had happened to the procession of Good Templars? Banners fluttered, drums thundered, boys swarmed, stamped and hurrahed. Or what had happened to the blue awnings under which the little ones slept while father and mother pushed them solemnly up the street? All were on their way out to the wood. They complained of the long streets. It seemed as if the stone houses followed them. At last they caught a glimpse of green. And just outside the town, where the road wound over flat, moist fields, where the song of larks sounded loudest, where the clover steamed with honey, there lay the first of those left behind, heads in the moss, noises in the grass, bodies bathed in sunshine and fragrance, souls refreshed with idleness and rest. On the way to the wood toiled bicyclists and bearers of luncheon baskets. Boys came with trowels and shiny knapsacks. Girls danced in clouds of dust. Sky and banners and children and trumpets. Mechanics and their families and crowds of laborers. The rearing horses of an omnibus waved their forelegs over the crowd. A young man, half drunk, jumped up on the wheel. He was pulled down and lay kicking on his back in the dust of the road. In the wood a nightingale trilled and sang, piped and gurgled. The birches were not thriving, their trunks were black. The beeches built high temples, layer upon layer of streaky green. A toad sat and took aim with its tongue. It caught a fly at every shot. A hedgehog trotted about in the dried, rustling beech leaves. Dragonflies darted about with glittering wings. The people sat down around the luncheon baskets. The piping, chirping crickets tried to make their Sunday a glad one. Suddenly the hedgehog disappeared. Terrified, he rolled himself up in his prickles. The crickets crept into the grass, quite silenced. The nightingale sang as if its throat would burst. It was guitars, guitars. The Salvation Army marched forward under the beeches. The people started up from their rest under the trees. The dancing green and croquet ground were deserted. The swings and merry-go-rounds had an hour's rest. Everybody followed the Salvation Army's camp. The benches filled, and listeners sat on every hillock. The army had waxed strong and powerful. About many a fair cheek was tied the Salvation Army hat. Many a strong man wore the red shirt. There was peace and order in the crowd. Bad words did not venture to pass the lips. Oaths rumbled harmlessly behind teeth. And Mats Wik, the shoemaker, the terrible blasphemer, stood now as standard bearer by the platform. He, too, was one of the believers. The red flag caressed his gray head. The Salvation Army soldiers had not forgotten the old man. They had him to thank for their first victory. They had come to him in his loneliness. They washed his floor and mended his clothes. They did not refuse to associate with him, and at their meetings he was allowed to speak. Ever since he had broken his silence, he was happy. He stood no longer as an enemy of God. There was a raging power in him. He was happy. He was happy when he could let it out. When souls were shaken by his lion voice, he was happy. He spoke always of himself. He always told his own story. He described the fate of the misjudged. He spoke of sacrifices of life itself, made without a hope of reward, without acknowledgment. He disguised what he related. He told his secret, and yet did not tell it. He became a poet. He had the power of winning hearts. For his sake, crowds gathered in front of the Salvation Army platform. He drew them by the fantastic images which filled his diseased brain. He captivated them with the words of affecting lament, which the oppression of his heart had taught him. Perhaps his spirit in days of old had visited this world of death and change. Perhaps he had then been a mighty skald, skillful in playing on heartstrings. But for some evil deed he had been commended to begin again his earthly life, to live by the work of his hands, without the knowledge of the strength of his spirit. But now his grief had broken his spirit's chains. His soul was a newly released bird, timid and confused, but still rejoicing in its freedom. It flew onward over the old battlefields. The wild, ignorant singer, the black thrush, which had grown among starlings, listened diffidently to the words which came to his lips. Where did he get the power to compel the crowd to listen in ecstasy to his speech? Where did he get the power to force proud men down upon their knees, wringing their hands? He trembled before he began to speak. Then a quiet confidence came over him. From the inexhaustible depths of his suffering rose ever torrents of agonized words. Those speeches were never printed. They were hunting cries, ringing trumpet notes, rousing, animating, terrifying, urgent, not to capture, not to give again. They were lightning flashes and rolling thunder. They shook hearts with terrible alarms, but they were transient, never could they be caught. The cataract can be measured to its last drop. The dizzy play of foam can be painted, but not the elusive, delirious, swift, growing, mighty stream of those speeches. That day in the wood he asked the gathering if they knew how they should serve God, as Uriah served his king. Then he, the man in the pulpit, became Uriah. He rode through the desert with the letter of his king. He was alone. The solitude terrified him. His thoughts were gloomy, but he smiled when he thought of his wife. The desert became a flowering meadow when he remembered his wife. Springs gushed up from the ground at the thought of her. His camel fell. His soul was filled with forebodings of evil. Misfortune, he thought, is a vulture which loves the desert. He did not turn, but went onward with the king's letter. He trod upon thorns. He walked among serpents and scorpions. He thirsted and hungered. He saw caravans drag their dark length through the sands. He did not join them. He dared not seek strangers. He who bears a royal letter must go alone. He saw at eventide the white tents of shepherds. He was tempted as if by his wife's smiling dwelling. He thought he saw white veils waving to him. He turned away from the tents out into solitude. Woe to him if they had stolen the letter of his king. He hesitates when he sees searching brigands pursuing him. He thinks of the king's letter. He reads it in order to then destroy it. He reads it and finds new courage. Stand up, warrior of Judah. He does not destroy the letter. He does not give himself up to the robbers. He fights and conquers. And so onward, onward. He bears his sentence of death through 1,000 dangers. It is so God's will shall be obeyed through tortures unto death. While Wik spoke, his divorced wife stood and listened to him. She had gone out to the wood that morning, beaming and contented on her husband's arm. Most matron-like, respectable in every fold. Her daughter and the apprentice carried the luncheon basket. The maid followed with the youngest child. There had been nothing but content, happiness, calm. There they had lain in a thicket. They had eaten and drunk, played and laughed. Never a thought of the past. Conscience was as silent as a satisfied child. In the beginning, when her first husband had slunk half drunk by her window, she had felt a prick in her soul. Then she had heard that he had become the idol of the Salvation Army. She was therefore quite calm. Now she had come to hear him. And she understood him. He was not speaking of Uriah. He was telling about himself. He was writhing at the thought of his own sacrifice. He tore bits from his own heart and threw them out among the people. She knew that rider in the desert, that conqueror of brigands, and that unappeased agony stared at her like an open grave. Night came. The wood was deserted. Farewell, grass and flowers. Wide heaven, a long farewell. Snakes began to crawl about the tufts of grass. Turtles crept along the paths. The wood was ugly. Everybody longed to be back in the stone desert, the moon landscape. That is the place for men. End of part 3 of A Fallen King. From Invisible Links by Selma Lagerlöf. Translated by Pauline Bancroft Flack. Read by Lars Rolander.